thanks everyone for being here. This is the first Westgrid seminar I've done. I've participated in anyway. It's great to see so many sites and so many individuals involved. This is a great example of bringing together lots of different people to talk about stuff of interest to the whole community. So today I want to talk a little bit about all the researcher input we've gathered nationally over the last few months and what we plan to do with it. My email address is here, jonathan.dursey@computecanada.ca. I'd encourage anyone to email me with any more questions or wanting any more information. I'm trying to distill almost 1,000 pieces of input gathered over months into a few slides in a few minutes, and so inevitably I'm going to be simplifying things and skipping things. I have much more information than I can present here today. So if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to contact me. So there's a couple different things you can talk about when you say Compute Canada does something. I mean, Compute Canada is this huge national project, the National Platform for Advanced Research Computing Expertise, Services, and Infrastructure. And we're trying to bring an entire national collection of expertise, services, and resources to bear on individual researchers' problems. So when I talk about Compute Canada here, I'm going to talk about us, the entire national project. That consists of a national office, sort of confusingly, of the same name. And our job is to keep the funding flowing and keep coordination internally on track, do things like advocacy, advocate for national or international collaborations, things like that. But all the actual work is done at the regional organizations, these organizations with autonomy, flexibility, and responsibilities to actually do the work and implement the platform. And then national level coordination on services and interoperability. So when I talk about Compute Canada, I mean all of us, the 140 technical staff coast to coast working on all parts of the project. And the mission right now, or recently, we've been describing our mission in terms of enabling Canadian research that needs HPC by providing access to the HPC resources, providing a national network of experts, and providing training, things like that. And what I want to talk a little bit about is all the researcher input we've gotten and how that's going to change a little bit how we think about our mission and how we actually do it. So the whole purpose of the enterprise is to support Canadian research, and so we can't be successful without strong mechanisms for researcher input. So we need to be able to provide what researchers need, and also keeping an eye out for what researchers will need in the future. So in the last years or so, many of the regional organizations are very well integrated into existing communities. So there's always this constant flow of feedback, but it isn't always disseminated or evenly distributed across the country. Different regions get different types of input, and there's necessarily sort of weaker connections to, and so input from researcher communities that aren't already big users, which is to say they're already successful with the current setup. So one of the big efforts since say last summer has been to get broad and start to get routine national researcher input to bring into the operations longer term planning and advocacy of the entire national operation. So we have we've recently done a bit on this. So there's the newly struck ACOR, Advisory Council on Research. So that's a national and fairly broad panel of researchers which directly advises the board of the Compute Canada National Office. There's a recent researcher needs survey that was running through late summer and the fall, which was a national 15-minute online survey. We had about 425 complete that. And then in December and January, there was a series of strategic plan consultations. there were something like 25 national face-to-face meetings, 500 people engaged in that. And of course, we've recently hired a chief science officer, Dugan O'Neill, Simon Fraser, whose job it is to sort of directly run some of these operations. I'm talking to you today because at the time we were invited to give this talk, Dugan wasn't our chief science officer yet, but he will be owning this sort of process in the future. So today my plan is to tell you a little bit about the planning process, the strategic plan, and we've been working on the management plan, and how the results of these national consultations, what those results have been and how they're actually shaping these plans. And I'd like to hear your feedback on these results I'm going to talk about, but also on mechanisms for getting sustained and continued input nationally and broadly, because it's great that we did this survey and it's great that we did these town halls, but we need sustained routine input and trying to figure out how to do that well on the national level. So are there questions? Are questions about sort of what I'm proposing as the topics of today? Any comments? All right, I'm going to proceed then. So I think many of you have heard, have been at one of the strategic plan consultations or read some of the materials. So I think the basic idea of the strategic plan is probably clear to you. It's in the process of a good draft is now being finalized and should be circulated publicly in a couple of weeks. And the purpose of the strategic plan is really a high-level set of discussions of the basic purpose and goals of the project. And the main goal is to build sort of written national agreement about what business we're in nationally, what broadly we should be doing to enable research. So it's not, its purpose is not to lay out specific projects to meet those goals. The first step is just to build national agreement about what those goals are. So things like more cloud computing, different training programs. Canada should try to do exascale by year 2000, and those do not show up in the strategic plan purposefully. That's not the purpose of the strategic plan. The purpose of the strategic plan is the big picture, broad goals. What is it all for? And we've talked about in the town halls why this is needed. The management plan, which sometimes gets called other things like an operations plan or something, starts fleshing out that strategic plan. So if those are our goals, those are our priorities, what do we do and how do we measure success at that? What is the process for determining things like investment priorities, like what sorts of computers we should be running, what our staffing levels should be? So even the management plan wouldn't sort of hard code in those priorities because stuff will change over fairly rapidly, but it will establish what the process is for determining these priorities. So the strategic plan town halls were really interesting events. St. John's to Victoria, hundreds and hundreds of attendees, and I was really surprised by the feedback in a few different senses. One, I was surprised by the differences of the meetings. They all had very different groups of people in different institutions, had very different focus. But I was also sort of surprised by the unanimity. So different meetings would focus on one or the other of these more, but all of these things were things that we heard at every single one of the meetings. The importance of people, the importance of storage and data, ease of use and interoperability, funding, supporting new use cases, industry engagement, the national and regional parts of our organization, and support for cutting-edge technologies. These are things that came up really at every single one of these meetings, all the online meetings, all of the in-person meetings. So one thing that was especially forcefully driven home was the importance of people, the importance of these 140 technical staff in getting research done. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that I was chased down halls by researchers to tell me how strong and capable and helpful the local support staff were, just about everywhere I went. So very high quality of technical staff. The consulting, the support, the training, these are all incredibly important, must be supported and grow ideally. The access to the compute and storage resources we provide nationally is vital, but for many, many research groups, without access to the technical expertise, the resources would be much less valuable to them. I think we all know that, but I was a little surprised at the passion with which that was expressed and the unanimity. Another thing that we heard just as passionately and just as consistently was issues with storage, that there's not nearly enough even for traditional sort of compute simulation intensive work, and for new data intensive work that people want to do. This is often, not uniformly, but on average, it's fairly poorly supported by the national project infrastructure. And of course, that storage is a very broad term. Different types of storage, whether it's archival, fast online, or anything in between, is all important. Another thing that came up quite a bit was usability issues, one way or the other. Our existing systems throw up a lot of roadblocks. So, for instance, the use of our systems is highly heterogeneous. If you use, say, a West Grid system, you get very, very, very knowledgeable of the ins and outs of that system. You are still starting from scratch if you're using a Calcul Quebec system, say, or anywhere else. I'm not picking those two groups out for any particular reason, but it's fair to say that our different systems are very different. And don't get me wrong, the diversity of systems we have is a strength, but in many cases, a lot of the differences in use, how you use the different systems, throws up roadblocks. There are other roadblocks too that affect some more than others. I heard from many people that interactive use is very important to them, and in some places that's harder to get access to. Things like web-based interfaces or cloud-based systems are issues. Funding came up absolutely everywhere. That the widespread agreement about the need for predictable, sustained funding for things like hardware, but also for staff, operating hardware. And it's not. This concern is shared throughout the entire research community. So in January, there was a digital infrastructure summit in Ottawa, where there was Industry Canada representation and representation from all the funding agencies, and they heard repeatedly from absolutely everyone that stuff like this is basic research infrastructure and needs to be funded like infrastructure, predictable, sustained. And from researchers, we heard that pushing that message, that advocacy like this has to be an activity of the national organization. One phrase that came up independently from several different researchers was, if not Compute Canada, then who? Right? It has to be us as a national organization, and us, especially the national office, has to be pushing this advocacy. Our researchers need us to do this. We need the researchers to help us with this. We need them to help us make the research cases for particular research cases. But this really has to be a part of our mission. New use cases was also something that came up again and again. A couple of these we've already touched on sort of data intensive, the need for different types of storage, cloud type workflows, but also sort of on the less specific side, there needs to be more support for researchers in disciplines with emerging compute requirements. Things like humanities, social sciences, bioinformatics as sort of broad discipline categories, but also for use cases regardless of the fields, like things like big data. These are crying needs, and I don't think any of this is hugely surprising. But again, we heard it everywhere, including at institutions where the main representatives were of very traditional physical sciences type user communities. We were still hearing this, and in some cases that means different hardware or software, but in other cases it means things like different processes, like allocation processes, or different new expertise has to be brought into the house so we can support some of these projects. Something that I feel like wouldn't have been so unanimous 5 years ago, but again came up at every single meeting, was the need for industry engagement, the need to encourage and develop programs for getting private sector R&D involved. Some of this was fairly, well, cynical is a strong word, but part of it was viewed as a way of making funders happy, but also just in terms of having an incoming stream of interesting applied research problems, making sure there's opportunities for graduate students in the private sector, increase HPC adoption, sort of grow the pie. And there were many different mechanisms suggested for this. I think there's a number of very concrete mechanisms that have been put forward that we could do this. But wide agreement that this should be a priority. Also, a lot of concern about how the structure of Compute Canada should work. This national project with both national and regional components, like what would that look like? So many examples were brought forward of organizations with similar sorts of structure. This actually isn't a particularly unusual arrangement. And the relationship doesn't need to be exactly the same in every single region, but lots of concern about the lack of clarity about this relationship. And that addressing this needs to be a high priority. And finally, just the importance of new technology. And part of this was the specific concern that our infrastructure is aging. But I think also just more broadly, even if there was a refresh, it was brought home very clearly that there needs to be constant investment at some modest level in all the various cutting-edge technologies, some of which may end up succeeding and being very important, and some of which may not. But having that available for our internal staff community to evaluate it for researchers unsure if it'll be useful or not, or for researchers who may not even be aware of it yet, but also for those researchers who are right on the leading edge of the computing technology and who want access to it right away. We can't support cutting-edge research if all we have is sort of mainstream or mature technologies. And many people felt that it should be part of the mission to help more actively shape technologies that are particularly important to Canadian research, rather than just be passive consumers of whatever's on the market. So these are the broad categories of things that we heard pretty much unanimous agreement on about the strategic plan. Are there questions or comments or thoughts on this sort of feedback? All right. So this material is being reflected in the strategic plan. I think it's become clear that We need to have a stronger emphasis on people and services. We need to grow into supporting broader use cases, but without sacrificing our existing HPC users. There needs to be more emphasis on the part of the national office on engaging with funders and engaging with the private sector, and negotiating clarity in the role of the national office versus the regions versus the sites. That's going to take time, but it's clearly going to be a goal. And now I want to talk briefly about the researcher needs survey. So this actually happened before the strategic plan town halls, October, but I think it's useful to talk about things in this order because this really is now especially relevant now that we're starting to think a little bit more about what a management plan would look like. So this was a short survey, talked about current research tasks, current pain points and priorities, future growth, and an opt-in for further contact so we can follow up with people. We haven't done that yet, and now I think we're better situated to be able to. So we wanted from this broad community results to identify groups for follow-up, with one-on-one interviews, maybe discussions with representative groups, and develop a pretty strong picture of what's needed by the community in the coming years. And there's lots of other sort of pieces of data we can use to complement this. Maybe most directly, Orion in Ontario did a needs assessment with about 50 to 100 really in-depth interviews with research groups across the province. It turns out their results, they're much more in-depth conversations, but they're very consistent with what we're seeing here, which is good. We have Compute Canada regional organizations, their user surveys and feedback from there. There's international things we can look at too. We had about 425 responses, overwhelmingly academic. And this represents a few things. I think, Compute Canada, nationally, when we send out a survey or regionally, it's largely our academic researchers who notice these things and who participate. There were also a number of other surveys and consultations that were in the field simultaneously. So we have a number of quantitative results, sort of fairly preliminary analysis that I can talk to a little bit, and I have, will be in the slides that get distributed. But I think more interesting is the qualitative stuff. Again, there were text fields about current research projects, the data they used, the analyses, their current bottlenecks, problems they had with existing services and resources, and things they'd like to see offered in the future. And here we heard many very, very similar things. Storage, we heard many stories, very specific stories about researchers wasting time shuffling, compressing, or regenerating data due to lack of storage, that more storage of various types were needed, that future needs were growing rapidly. Aging infrastructure being a problem, with almost a couple hundred respondents saying that, in very clear terms and very specifically to their projects, that they could do more and better research if they had more and better access to compute and storage. And, unreliability, which is related in part to aging infrastructure, was also pointed out as a real issue. A number of usage barriers were brought up, some of which, again, we already heard in the we've already discussed from the strategic plan consultations, but the lack of interactive access. Many cited the lack of large memory nodes across the country, the relative paucity of those, long queue times. Last mile connectivity, which isn't our responsibility, but it's a problem that researchers have in accessing our resources. So is our concern, even if we're not going to be stringing fiber. Uptime and reliability, commercial software licensing, things that I think many of us who have worked on the sort of front lines will be familiar with. But it's interesting to see the number of times this comes up across the country. Sharing, many researchers would like to be able to share either their compute processes or codes through web interfaces, or sharing their data in a secure or in a completely open way. Came up again and again. Again, very strong support for the existing support and training work. But it's also true that I think we may not, at least in all regions, be doing as good a job as we could be of advertising the sort of work that our technical staff can do, because there were many Compute Canada users in these surveys who said that they needed help with fairly straightforward things like automation or optimizing their codes that do not appear to be aware that our existing technical staff can help them with that. And also a broad problem that I think we all are aware of, but it's interesting to see how strongly the researchers feel about it, is that their incoming graduate students do not have the basic skills they need to be productive computational researchers, and many hoping that Compute Canada, the national project, can play a role in that one way or another. So I have some fairly straightforward quantitative slides. It's interesting to see how strongly Compute Canada, how much of a role this plays in the computational research across Canada. We have some quantitative sets of measures about what the current pain points are, what their priorities for future investments are. These will be in the slides. I don't think it's especially helpful for me to walk you through a bunch of broad bar charts. But so I think our next steps for this survey are to begin follow-up work, and begin talking to the researchers who have opted in to participate in the follow-up. I think we're going to have to continue to talk with some of these underrepresented sectors, find out what their needs are, and compare this with complementary data. And more broadly, we'll be sharing a strategic plan draft in a couple of weeks with, internally, but with the research community broadly. As sort of agreement on that converges, start thinking about the management plan. And these research needs survey results will feed, I think, into more concrete programs and needs that would be reflected in that management plan. And that's it. I'd love to talk with you more about these results, about how they'll be used in planning, but also how we can be more often and more effectively consulting with researchers. So this ACORE, the Advisory Council on Research, will be standing, and in fact growing a little bit. So that's a resource we can use. Another resource we can use is that at some point in the fairly near future, there'll be a new web page that will actually be routinely updated with useful information and planning documents and things. So that'll be a way of distributing information. But what are good mechanisms for getting feedback directly from the broad community? We have ACORE, but we can't necessarily we can't ask them. It's unfair to ask them to represent the tens of thousands of Canadian researchers who we'd like to be able to support. So would doing things like annual in-person town halls be useful? We already have things like town halls at HPCS, but actually the broader community would routinely touring be a good way of doing it? Would annual things like this survey be a good way of doing it? I think we're open to a wide range of mechanisms because of the importance of this. So thoughts, questions, comments?
Any questions from any of the sites? We have Patrick waving at U of C, I believe. Your audio is a bit quiet, U of C, so if you could speak up or right at the mic, that would be great.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I was just, to your question, I think, you know, the annual survey is good. I think the idea of having a presentation around, you know, the results of the survey. So you're doing this for West Group, but I mean, that could be done on a large scale, so that, you know, people actually know that they'll see the results of what, you know, what went into it, and they can be more involved in the process. I think that would be good.
I think that's right, and we've seen this internally when there was a national survey of our internal HQP. It had been the second survey in 2 years, and the staff were very skeptical of continuing to fill out these surveys, but they felt much more positively predisposed to it once the results started being circulated around. I mean, you know, filling out these surveys, taking the time to come to strategic plan town halls or whatever, that's a real investment in people's time, and you're asking a lot of them to continue doing this. And the more you can demonstrate that, you know, we're actually listening and acting on this input, I think the more, you know, the more goodwill we build and the more willingness to participate further, I think. So this is great. Being asked to present here, I think, is a great first step.
Our support ticketing systems have a ton of information in them about pain points and what researchers are working on. I mean, some of your points, like grad students coming in with a lot of naive questions, I see that certainly in our support tickets. It can be kind of painful to dive in depth into ticketing systems, into tickets. But I think there's a lot of information there if we wanted it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's another great source of information. I mean, this database, you know, all of these tickets that exist, you know, across the country, sort of mining those one way or another for specific pain points, I think would be another really valuable way of, you know, sort of making data, you know, evidence-based decisions about, you know, what needs to be fixed.
Yeah, I'd like to agree with what's been said already. The annual surveys and hearing about the results of them now is very important for people who are already using Compute Canada resources. I think, though, what you mentioned about an in-person town hall might be a way to involve people who aren't yet active users.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I mean, obviously we need to know whether we're serving our existing users well, but you run the risk of sort of, you know, only, building those walls instead of tearing them down by only hearing feedback from existing users, right? So I think you're absolutely right. We need to actively be, reach out and be seen to be reaching out to those communities that are either geographic or disciplinary or whatever that aren't currently users.
Just here a little comment from you, Vic. So basically, like last time when we had that survey about researchers, like what they did, like publications and things like that, I found it a little bit very hard to push our researchers to do that. So, and they are willing to do that, but I mean, we keep bothering them with the racks. With many things, actually, they have to keep like renewing their accounts and things like that. So I think we might need to a little bit work hard on our side. For example, counting their publications, someone should take care of that. Looking at the website, looking at things. If he sees the acknowledgement, he should add it in there. So some of them, they actually suggest this to go to their website and see what they did, the recent stuff, any acknowledgement of WestGrid or Compute Canada, then we should, relieve them from such duties. Like, it's just small things that we can do from our side.
I think that's true, and I think so. So the CSO will be, our new Chief Science Officer will be looking into, like, rethinking the rack a little bit. The account renewal stuff is extremely important, but it's quite onerous for casual users. If you're using tens of millions of CPU hours and petabytes of storage, and it's not an unreasonable thing to ask, but for people who are, who make much less use, it really is quite a process. So anything we can do to lower that, to lower that sort of busy work we ask of researchers, I think is strongly worth looking into. So somehow, changing or making the rack process easier, for instance. One thing that's come up, and it's not clear how practical it is, but it might, it could well be something as simple as tying into the existing common CV, which researchers need to update for grant proposals anyway, and getting things like publications from that. Or I think there's a lot of things we can do that will help us do the reporting we need, but also be less work for the researchers. And I'm not really the person to lead that discussion, but that is high on our Chief Science Officer's agenda. I mean, it's just like what you said. A lot of the mechanical stuff, like publication, we'd like to reduce that load on them, so the conversations we do ask them to have can be more useful. Like how can we help you better? What resources do you need in a couple of years?
Go ahead. Hi. I'm a grad student. I work a lot with simulation and with lots and lots of data storage. So some of the comments I've seen in this presentation, I'll add another name to the list. I have a comment about consulting and reaching out to the community. I used to use WestGrid for about a year, but I found the emails and the messages that the community was sending out to try and solicit feedback, to try and hand out information, to be exceedingly alienating. So as somebody who was using the system, it seemed like all of the communication was directed at administrative parties. So for me, the person using it, the person having to interact with it, when I see something that is trying to reach out to people that are 2 layers above me, I just throw out those emails, I disregard the communications, and I learn that anything coming from WestGrid or Compute Canada is junk mail. So when I see consultation like this, and I see a very enormous response from one particular group, but not from others, I have to wonder if those facts are related in any way, because it doesn't seem like these things are meant to address the whole community. It seems like they are tailored for one group.
Certainly being more targeted in our and both. Being more targeted in our communications for particular for particular sorts of emails would be valuable. But I also think when we, showing people the value in the communication, so things like when we do ask for information, showing how it's used. I think both of those things, so we're not flooding people with information, and when we are, making sure it's valuable. I think those are two sort of sides of the same coin. We need to be more thoughtful in our communications on a number of different levels.
I'd like to ask a little bit more about, you talked about people wanting web interfaces, and I mean that can just mean so many things. Yeah. So I just wondered, I mean there's scientific gateways for particular disciplines or for particular projects, but then you also mentioned just a web-based interface to data, and that could be much more generic. But I just wondered what the sort of spectrum of those things, those different type of use cases were. and as well how you think that might fit in with CFI's funding suggestions around supporting tools as well as infrastructure.
I think a lot of them were. I think the two biggest categories were of what we would consider the scientific gateway things, the sort of portals to particular codes and data. So those were by far the two biggest sorts of things we heard. But everything imaginable comes into this too. And probably, yeah, anything you could imagine probably came up at least once in one response. So obviously, I think, in a way that's good, I guess. It means there's a lot of appetite out there. It means that there are a couple, if not low-hanging fruits, at least, the fruit may still be high, but it's obviously quite big. So there's obviously a couple targets there that I think would be worth going after. But yeah, there's a huge appetite for a broader range of access methods, and not unreasonably so. Other questions or thoughts?
Oh, I was just going to just about the CFI question. I mean, how this sort of information about people's needs of software tools and interfaces, how that might get fed back into the CFI process.
Sorry, yes, I didn't. Yes. Well, I mean, I think on one hand, I think it's clear that CFI is onto something because there are a lot of needs about that. How to follow up is an interesting question. I think it would be interesting. I think the various people who have brought it up, I think would be. I don't know if they all know about the upcoming Cyber Infrastructure Fund, and this could be a possibility. Whether we could, work with them to put something together for that, or whether we could maybe group users with similar needs. So I think that's going to come down a lot to what information we get from these researchers when we follow up with them. But I mean, I think it's exciting. I think that part of the Cyber Infrastructure Fund competition really does respond to a real need out there that's just very broadly held.
Yeah, Jonathan, I had one other point was sort of in the strategic plan, and part of this going to CFI business. It's just that one of the things that jumped out to me was the emphasis on the straight hardware, the infrastructure. You need compute, memory, and storage, and when you start getting into extensions to strategic plans, it's very easy to get spread pretty thin and to start missing those real basics. And I think it's good still to emphasize that to our funders that in the end we need the compute, the resources. I won't pull through anyhow. Yeah.
Exactly. No, and I'll add to that people that these are these higher level things are very exciting, very interesting, would open up these resources to a broader community, but they will not be useful running on 10-year-old hardware, or people who are, or with fewer and fewer staff who have to leave and take other jobs because their salaries aren't guaranteed for more than a year at a time. So the good news I can offer there is that those concerns are extremely broadly held, and not just amongst Compute Canada type users. Again, at this Digital Infrastructure Summit, librarians who have data storage needs, humanities researchers, very disparate communities realize the importance of this infrastructure-like funding, predictable, sustained. This stuff needs to be here. It needs to be stuff. It needs to be stuff that you don't have to think about, so that you can build these higher level services. So, there's no obvious, there's no funding round or anything I can point to, but the community has the entire research community has come to agree on this. So hopefully at some point something will get done.
One of the things, Jonathan, I think that Rob just remind me of is the fact that last time when we trying to gather what we are supposed to be having in that strategic plan, I think like the middleware is one of the important aspect, and like we are keep, for example, on a bunch of software even Globus Online and all these things. These are tools that help people outside, so that should be there. Otherwise, it's just people, they would think that this hardware is just running magically like that. You need a middleware, you need a bunch of effort to get it. So although people out there, people they would think it's just an expertise to help others, but actually some of them, they have to deal with all these nifty things with the middleware software and stuff. So I think some software naming there should appear somehow in that strategic plan.
Yeah, I think it won't come up as specifically as terms like software, middleware, but it will come up in terms like accessibility and usability, and making these resources and the expertise more broadly available.
That's much better even. Yeah, I think that's even more general. Okay, thanks.
Okay, I think our time together is nearly coming to an end. Are there any final questions, thoughts, comments? And I'll just say, I would encourage you to email me. I'm just going to put my email address back up. I would love to continue this conversation about continuing conversations, and please do not hesitate to email me with any thoughts or comments or questions.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think my big concern is because we just been through in UBC here, we've been through some kind of a centralization storm. So the big concern is about the funding. So it looks like the Computer Canada tried to become an organization which can do everything. They want to centralize everything. I guess we as local IT staff, we tried over years to build up some of our own solutions. And we also thirsty for funding, say, from CFI. And once you say we can do everything, then the funding will go to Computer Canada, so we've got no funding will be cut off. And but at the meantime, I believe there's a gap between you can provide a solution while we get cut off already. So this will be a big gap. And also, I don't think Computer Canada can do everything eventually, because there's all kinds of needs. So my suggestion is, when you put together a plan, you should also concern there's got to be something be done better locally by the staff member very close to the researcher. That's just my concern.
Well, so I think so. I mean, so one of the strong advantages, of course, of Compute Canada is that in lots of different places. But you're absolutely right. Nobody can do everything, no matter how tightly you scope their requirements. I think so. CFI, I think in the current Innovation Fund call, I think finally clarifies a little bit of their funding. CFI would, of course, prefer would prefer two things. One, not to duplicate its own investments, right? Not to spend money on 50, 100 data centers in the same campus. Not to, wherever possible, to consolidate the money they spend, and wherever possible, they'd also like to spend money on infrastructure that can help 3 or 5 or 10 groups rather than one group where possible. So CFI, I think, has clarified that a bit, but it's also said now, I think for the first time actually come out and said that, but that approach doesn't work for everything. And so it is willing to consider things that are not part of a national platform, as long as it's clear that the institution that gets awarded the award is going to have to stand up and pay for the operations and maintenance, that money isn't coming from CFI. So I think that's the right balance. CFI has goals it wants to accomplish with its money, but it's willing it's willing to make other investments as well. So I think that's right, and I think Compute Canada and the regional organizations, we're not interested in sneaking into researchers' labs through the windows and making off with their servers in the dead of night. We want to run a national platform that's as useful to as many people as possible, and where other groups, whether they're individual researchers or whether they're universities that provide unusually strong levels of research computing support, so UBC is one, McMaster in Ontario is another, working with them as partners to do this shared mission of supporting advanced research computing in Canada. Thanks everyone for participating. Please do email me. And goodbye.
Thanks, John.